Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep today into one of the most fraught, most complex areas of international geopolitics, the India-Pakistan relationship.
It really is. I mean, it's a place where the normal rules of diplomacy sometimes feel like they just don't apply.
They really don't. And we're looking at it through a very specific, and I think a very revealing lens, the price of diplomatic credit. We have a stack of sources detailing the perspective from New Delhi concerning the widely reported ceasefire that followed the Pahalgam attack.
Right. And the real meat of it is why India was, uh, let's say, vehemently reluctant to credit the Trump administration, or any third party for that matter, for engineering peace.
Because it seems like such a simple thing, right?
Yeah.
Thank you. A diplomatic nod, but the sources we have suggest it's just completely missing the point.
It's so much more than a spat over who gets credit for a win. This deep dive, I think, goes right to the heart of India's strategic thinking. Their refusal, according to this analysis, it wasn't personal. It wasn't about ego.
It was a doctrine.
It was purely doctrinal. A core strategic refusal rooted in, well, an existential assessment of its neighbor and a security doctrine that's been in place for decades. For India, you have to understand, granting that credit would be the same as undermining its own national sovereignty. It's that serious.
So our mission then is to really dissect why India views that whole narrative, that Donald Trump somehow swooped in and engineered peace, not just as wrong, but as strategically toxic.
Yeah, toxic is a good word for it.
We need to understand the conflict between that external, transactional narrative and India's internal doctrinal need to manage what it sees as a permanent existential threat.
And the stakes here are, they're just immense. This isn't abstract. It defines how India manages terrorism and, of course, the non-negotiable status of Kashmir.
So where do we begin? To get our heads around this, what's the starting point?
The starting point, and we have to establish this right up front, is the foundational premise that New Delhi operates under. This is the single most important nugget of knowledge for anyone, really, trying to understand India's behavior in this region. And the sources are absolutely blunt about it.
Which is?
There is no peace, only a pause.
Wow. Okay, no peace, only a pause.
That phrase, it just sums up the enormous strategic distance between New Delhi's operational reality and the way the Western diplomatic world often wants to see the conflict.
So when the U.S. or Europe sees a ceasefire, they see what? A success, a step forward.
They see a peace dividend. They see an opportunity. They check a box.
Yeah.
But India sees a temporary tactical intermission. They see a countdown clock starting for the next round of conflict.
Because they believe their adversary isn't looking for a stable balance.
They believe their adversary fundamentally rejects the very idea of a stable equilibrium. So a pause is just that, a chance to regroup.
That sets the stage perfectly because it suggests India defines its neighbor, Pakistan, in a way that is profoundly different from how, say, the State Department typically defines a conventional nation-state.
Completely different.
When we think of countries, we think of, borders, treaties, mutual interest, a search for some kind of stability, even between rivals.
Right, a game with rules.
Exactly. But our sources here, they highlight Pakistan's nature as something else. They describe it not as a conventional nation-state seeking that stable equilibrium, but as a permanent ideological project.
And if you don't get that fundamental distinction, if you don't internalize it, you will misunderstand every single move India makes from that point on.
Because a conventional state, when it signs a treaty, is looking for a deal.
It's transactional.
Mm-hmm.
A conventional nation state, whether it's the U.S., Canada, even historic rivals like Germany and France, when they agree to a ceasefire, they are fundamentally seeking a balance. They want to reduce costs, they want a trade-off, or they want a stable environment to, grow their economy.
But if you're an ideological project,
then your goals aren't transactional. They're absolute. India views Pakistan's very definition of itself as being hostile to the concept of stable coexistence.
Okay, you've got to elaborate on that concept. Permanent ideological project.
Yeah.
What does that actually look like in practice? How is it different from just a really intense border conflict?
Well, the sources make a really provocative comparison, but I think it's one that's essential for clarity.
What's the comparison?
They compare Pakistan specifically to the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Okay, wow. That is a heavy comparison.
It is. And it's not about geography or trade or anything like that. It's about the ideological structure of the state itself, the reason for the state's existence.
That's a powerful analogy. Let's really dive into that detail. What does comparing Pakistan to Iran tell us about how India sees Pakistan's long-term goals?
It clarifies the nature of the conflict as being existential, rather than transactional.
Explain that difference.
Okay, so look at Iran's stated objective toward Israel. It's not transactional in the way we normally think about conflict.
Meaning their goal isn't just to win a battle.
Right, the goal isn't to defeat Israel's army, occupy a piece of territory in the Negev desert, and then sit at a peace table to negotiate water rights. That would be transactional. Their objective, as stated over and over in their official doctrine, is existential. It is to end Israel as a nation-state.
The erasure of the other state.
The civilizational erasure of the other state from the map. The goal itself is absolute.
So applying that same logic, that same doctrinal framework to the India-Pakistan relationship.
New Delhi believes Pakistan operates under a very similar framework. The ultimate goal isn't just winning a border dispute over Kashmir or acquiring a bit of territory.
It's something deeper.
It's much deeper, more religious, and more permanent. It's a goal that at its core rejects the very concept of a multi-faith, secular India existing right next to it.
The sources must get into the specifics of this ideology, right? It can't just be a general feeling.
Oh, they do. They detail the specific ideological goal that permeates what they call Pakistan's deep state, that interlocking military clerical ecosystem. The doctrine is known as Ghazwa-e-Hind.
For our listeners who may not have heard that term, can you provide some background on what that means?
Ghazwa-e-Hind translates roughly as the conquest of India. But the sources are very careful to emphasize that within the context of Pakistan's military clerical establishment, it carries this profound connotation of a religious conquest.
And more than just conquest.
Yes, and the eventual forcible conversion of its people. And this is the crucial part. The sources stress this is not some historical footnote. It's not fringe rhetoric from some minor extremist group.
They see it as mainstream.
They describe it as something that is woven into Pakistan's military clerical ecosystem. It's their operational ideological North Star. It justifies the long-term, non-conventional, permanent conflict.
Okay, I have to step in here as the skeptical listener. If this is truly the pervasive guiding ideology, if the deep state's mission is the existential erasure of its neighbor, doesn't that create a huge strategic contradiction?
How so?
Well, if the goal is so absolute, so existential, why would they ever agree to a ceasefire? Why would they ever pause? Wouldn't that contradict the whole ideological project?
That is an excellent and absolutely necessary question.
Yeah.
And that's where the concept of the pause we started with comes in. The implication of this ideological project isn't that Pakistan will just relentlessly attack 204/7 until victory or defeat. The goal is too vast, too generational for that.
So they're pragmatic about it.
They have to be.
Yeah.
So Pakistan doesn't abandon its primary objective. It just recognizes its limitations in the moment. It pauses when the costs get too high, when India's response is too painful, or when the geopolitical environment is unfavorable.
And then
it waits. It regroups its forces, it rearms its proxies, finds new funding, and eventually when the time is right, it will resume the effort. This is the ultimate long game.
So the cycle of conflict isn't truly a cycle of war and peace. It's a cycle of war, a temporary break for tactical reasons, and then more war when conditions are better.
That's it exactly. India is essentially planning for the next round before the current one is even fully over.
That must be an exhausting way to run a country's foreign policy.
It is. For India, seeing Pakistan as this ideological project means recognizing that any diplomatic agreement, any ceasefire, is inherently unreliable, because the core governing philosophy of the other state remains completely unchanged. A ceasefire isn't peace. It is simply a tactical intermission.
The conflict is defined as existential rather than transactional.
Meaning, any diplomatic move that reduces violence is only buying time. It doesn't solve the underlying ideological drive, it just puts it on hold.
I think we need to just linger on the sheer weight of that for a moment. If you, as the Indian government, genuinely believe your neighbor's entire reason for being is your ultimate destruction, then offering them diplomatic credit for a peace deal is not just naive, it's not just a mistake. The sources seem to be saying it's seen as actively collaborating in your own long-term demise.
You're validating their tactics. You're telling them that their strategy of fight, then pause, works. You're helping them achieve their intermission on favorable terms.
It's a profound difference in worldview.
It is. And the question I want to leave with you, the listener, as we move to the next part is this. If the stated goal of a nuclear-armed state is the civilizational erasure of its neighbor, can any short-term diplomatic maneuver truly be called peace? And from everything we're reading, India answers that question with a very loud, very emphatic no.
So we've established this Existential ideological framework. Now let's bring that down from the 30,000-foot view to concrete, observable actions on the ground.
Right. How does this grand ideology actually translate into policy?
The sources transition to discussing just that, focusing on the specific sequence of events leading up to the Pahalgam attack, which is the flashpoint for this entire discussion we're having.
And this is key. New Delhi views the actions around that attack as deliberate, strategic, and a direct declaration of renewed confrontation.
Not an accident, not a mistake.
Not an accident, not some rogue group getting out of control. This was, in their view, a tactical choice made by the country's real power center. It was the system operating exactly as it was designed to.
The sources pinpoint a very specific signal that came before the violence, which they say is critical for establishing that strategic intent.
They do. It was a public speech made by the Pakistan Army Chief, Asim Munir.
And we need to emphasize who he is. The source describes him as, quote, effectively the country's supreme authority.
Yes, we have to recognize that. The civilian government in Pakistan is, often just window dressing. The prime minister makes speeches, but the army chief makes policy.
So when he speaks, the world, and especially India, listens very carefully.
And the location of this signal is just as crucial, maybe even more so than the exact words he used.
Where did he give this speech?
He made this carefully coded, but to India, unmistakable speech. A signal of renewed confrontation in Queens, New York.
Get out of here. Queens.
Queens, New York. Not in Islamabad, not in a military garrison in Rawalpindi.
On American soil. I mean, think about the psychological impact of that.
It's enormous. He chose American soil to send a strategic message to India. He was signaling not only his resolve, but also a degree of strategic confidence. He was basically betting that the U.S. sphere of influence could somehow buffer or contain any severe Indian military response.
That location alone is just dripping with subtext. It's an implicit challenge to Washington, saying, we are conducting our policy even from your backyard.
That's how it was read in New Delhi. And then, very shortly after this speech, the Pahalgam attack occurs.
And the sources view this sequence signal, followed by violence, as absolutely
not accidental, that's the quote. They see it as deliberate, state-backed, and strategic.
This sequence links the intent of the military leadership directly to the kinetic action on the ground.
It does. And that, in turn, brings us to the absolute core of the ISI and Pakistan Army doctrine, something that intelligence agencies worldwide have recognized for years.
What is that core doctrine?
Terrorism is not a deviation. It is the primary instrument of policy.
Let's repeat that because it's so counterintuitive to a Western mindset. Terrorism is not a deviation. It is the primary instrument of policy.
It's not seen as an embarrassing byproduct of instability that needs to be cleaned up. It's not a bug, it's a feature. It is a tool intentionally designed and wielded by the state to achieve specific geopolitical goals that conventional warfare simply cannot achieve for them.
I think that's the biggest hurdle for the average listener in the West to get over. The idea that a state would intentionally use terrorism as a primary controlled policy instrument. We tend to see it as a symptom of a failed state.
Right. But here, the argument is that it's a tool of a rational, albeit ideological, state actor.
So let's elaborate on the playbook. If terrorism is the primary instrument, what are its core features that make it so effective for Pakistan, according to these sources?
The sources outline three key interlocking features that make up the Pakistani strategic playbook in Kashmir. First, and most obviously, is proxy violence.
Using non-state actors.
Always. This allows the state to maintain a crucial degree of plausible deniability. They are not officially sending their own army units across the line of control because that would trigger an open war they can't win. They're sending groups that are state-funded, state-trained, and state-directed, but not officially state-badged.
And that deniability is the second feature.
It leads directly to it. Deniability is the shield. It allows Pakistan to evade the most punishing international sanctions or direct large-scale military retribution from India. They can always point to the civilian government and say, we're trying our best, or claim these are rogue elements, even when all the intelligence points directly to deep state support.
And the third feature, which is maybe the most strategically sophisticated, is what the sources call calibrated escalation.
Calibrated escalation is the real art form of this policy. It means they don't just unleash chaos randomly. They have the ability to turn the dial of violence up or down with incredible precision to achieve a specific strategic or diplomatic reaction.
Give me a practical example of what that calibration looks like on the ground.
Okay, so a low-level calibration might be targeting a specific military outpost just to provoke a localized Indian response and keep tensions simmering. But they'd avoid a massive infrastructure target that would compel India to cross the line of control with heavy forces.
And a high-level calibration.
A high-level calibration is the Pahalgam attack, an attack large enough, spectacular enough to create maximum global media attention, to compel Washington and other powers to worry about a potential nuclear escalation, and thereby force the U.S. into a mediation role.
So the violence isn't random. It's proportional to the diplomatic goal they're trying to achieve at that moment.
Exactly. So for New Delhi, the assessment of the Pahalgam attack isn't complicated at all. It was a deliberate, strategic, state-enabled action, a high-dial maneuver designed specifically to force outside intervention.
And this is the essential, so what context for our listener? It frames everything that happens next.
It really does. It frames India's military response and the whole diplomatic dance not as a failure of politics where two sides just accidentally stumbled into a crisis.
But as a direct expected consequence of a pre-declared ideological strategic policy. If the state uses terror as its main policy tool, then any effective response from India has to be aimed at dismantling that policy, not just managing the immediate burst of violence.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting and where that policy of terrorism connects right back to the core ideological project we started with.
Yes, the why.
We've established that the use of terror is calibrated, so why is it the preferred tool? The sources argue it's because it serves a singular, overarching geopolitical aim that Pakistan is simply incapable of achieving through conventional, above-board means. And to understand that, you first have to understand Pakistan's fundamental limitations. Those limitations are what define its strategic toolkit.
What are those limitations?
Militarily, the sources are explicit. Pakistan cannot defeat India in a conventional full-scale war. The asymmetry in terms of military size, economic power, and strategic depth is just too great.
Okay, so conventional war is off the table as a winning strategy.
And diplomatically, especially in global forums like the UN, Pakistan largely lacks the leverage it needs to force a significant change in the status quo over Kashmir. They just don't have the votes or the influence.
So they're playing with a weak hand, really, in both conventional military and diplomatic terms.
Well, a very weak hand, which forces them to adopt unconventional strategies. They need a tool that overcomes both their military weakness and their diplomatic isolation.
And that tool is terrorism.
That's where the calibrated use of terrorism comes in. It's their most effective lever. According to the sources, it's maybe their only effective lever. Terrorism, when it's controlled and escalated just enough, is the one tool they have that effectively forces external actors. And the sources are specific here, pointing to the United States primarily, to step in as third-party mediators.
So the intervention itself is the prize.
The intervention is the victory. That's the crucial strategic incentive. The goal is to create just enough tension, just enough instability that Washington or Beijing feels compelled to get involved. Not because they care deeply about Kashmir, but because they are terrified of a full-scale, nuclear-tinged regional war between two major powers.
By forcing that third-party involvement, Pakistan achieves its ultimate geopolitical goal.
Which is the internationalization of the Kashmir issue.
And what does that mean to internationalize it?
It changes the entire dynamic of the dispute. It rips it out of the hands of just India and Pakistan. It forces India to a negotiating table where an external power is now present, with its own agenda, its own leverage, and its own interests.
And this is, without question, India's absolute red line, the hill they will die on, diplomatically speaking.
Absolutely. For decades, India's position has been completely non-negotiable, and it was crystallized in the 1972 Simla Agreement.
The Simla Agreement.
That agreement states that Kashmir is fundamentally and irrevocably a bilateral issue.
Meaning only India and Pakistan will discuss its status. No one else gets a seat at that table.
No one. No UN, no US, no China, nobody.
Let's pause and really expand on the significance of that agreement, because it seems like the entire strategic backbone of India's stance rests on it. Why is that specific bilateral clause so inviolable? What's so special about it?
Well, the Simla Agreement was signed right after the 1971 war, which was a decisive military victory for India. India could have imposed much harsher terms. But the core of the agreement was designed specifically to prevent the very thing Pakistan is constantly trying to achieve now.
It was forward-looking.
Very. By making all future issues related to Kashmir strictly bilateral, India legally and diplomatically closed the door to the kind of third-party meddling that had characterized the conflict before then. If India ever, for 1 second, conceded that a third party has a legitimate role in de-escalation or negotiation, that entire strategic doctrine just collapses.
What happens then?
It opens up the floodgates to external pressure, UN resolutions, sanctions, all things that India firmly believes fall outside the scope of its national sovereignty on this issue.
I want to introduce some friction here, again playing the role of the skeptical observer. Wouldn't conventional real politics suggest that sometimes you have to make a small compromise? Isn't accepting a minor, temporary, transactional compromise like letting the U.S. quietly facilitate de-escalation worth it if it prevents a potential nuclear conflict? Isn't that an acceptable cost for safety?
And that question gets to the absolute core of the philosophical disagreement. From India's perspective, the answer is no. Absolutely not. Any third-party mediation is not seen as helpful conflict resolution. It is inherently seen as a catastrophic strategic loss.
Why a loss? If it stops a war, isn't it a win?
It's a loss because it validates the method used to achieve it.
Which is?
Terrorism. It proves that terrorism works. If Pakistan can use violence to successfully attract powerful outside intervention and elevate the issue from a bilateral dispute to a full-blown international crisis, India has, in effect, rewarded that violent behavior with a massive diplomatic success. You have fundamentally changed the incentive structure for all future actions.
So if India rewards the violent act with diplomatic leverage, it's basically greenlighting Pakistan to do it again, maybe even with more force next time, just to get that international spotlight back.
Precisely. You're teaching them that the playbook works. India's doctrine is crystal clear and has been consistent across all governments, all parties, for 50 years. It cannot and will not reward terrorism by granting it diplomatic power or allowing the issue to be internationalized. The stability of the entire region, as New Delhi sees it, depends on that ironclad principle. The use of terror will achieve zero political or diplomatic leverage, period.
To compromise on the bilateral nature of Kashmir is to hand Pakistan a strategic victory it could never, ever earn on the battlefield.
That's the bottom line.
So we have the framework.
Yeah.
This existential conflict, terrorism as a policy tool, and internationalization as the ultimate goal. With all that strategic context in mind, let's move to the specific events after the Pahalgam attack.
Right. Let's contrast the dominant international narrative that Trump engineered peace with India's actual detailed account of how the ceasefire came about.
What was India's immediate response to the attack?
India's response was very measured, but also very decisive. It was entirely designed to adhere to its doctrine, no full-scale war, while still imposing a heavy and painful cost on Pakistan's terrorist infrastructure. Their action was characterized by three things. It was limited, it was precise, and it was pre-declared.
What does pre-declared mean in this context?
It means they were signaling the limits of their action from the start. They were not signaling a new open-ended war. They were communicating, this is a punitive strike, and it will have a clear end.
What were the specifics of the operation? How did they ensure the action stayed limited?
The sources detail that Indian forces destroyed approximately a dozen terrorist camps across Pakistan. The key here was the targeting selection. It was incredibly tight.
They weren't just hitting random military bases.
No, absolutely not. The action was tightly scoped to target known terrorist infrastructure, launch pads, training facilities, the actual instruments of the attack. They specifically avoided general military targets or critical civilian infrastructure that could lead to a wider war.
And here is the essential pivot point in the timeline that so often gets lost in the international media coverage. Immediately after this specific, limited, punitive action, India declared its position publicly.
Yes, this is crucial. India announced that no further military action would follow.
So they were drawing their own red line.
They were. By defining the scope of their response and then immediately declaring an end to their military action, India was, in effect, already making a unilateral ceasefire offer.
They were saying, we have exacted the punishment required for the attack, the situation is now contained from our side, and we stop here. The ball is in your court.
Precisely. It was a very responsible military move designed to de-escalate. But Pakistan chose not to accept that offer.
Instead, they escalated. They tried to turn this bilateral event into that international crisis they wanted.
They absolutely escalated. They raised the danger level exponentially, which is the whole point of calibrated escalation. You create panic to draw in the big players. This led to a period of genuine, undeniable danger where the possibility of a miscalculation between two nuclear-armed states became terrifyingly real.
And this is the moment where the international community, and specifically the United States, felt it had to step in.
Yes, the alarm bells were ringing in Washington.
We need to be very nuanced here about the role the sources attribute to the U.S. They don't just dismiss it, right?
No, they're careful to be factual and fair. They absolutely acknowledge that the United States played a constructive de-escalatory role during this most dangerous phase.
Through whom?
Particularly through the Secretary of State and other high-level defense officials. They were working the phones constantly, urging caution on both sides and making sure channels of communication remained open. And this contribution, the sources explicitly note, is acknowledged in New Delhi. India is not denying that the U.S. played a positive stabilizing role in that moment of high tension.
But, and this is the vital distinction we keep coming back to, acknowledgement of a de-escalation effort is not the same thing as attribution of a peace deal.
Exactly. The U.S. helped lower the temperature, but India insists they did not broker the final agreement.
So what was the critical maneuver that guaranteed the bilateral nature of the resolution? How did India pull it back from the brink of internationalization?
It came at the moment of truth. Pakistan, likely recognizing the dangers of its own escalation and perhaps sensing the potential for further, non-limited Indian strikes, finally conveyed a request for a formal ceasefire.
But they didn't call New Delhi.
No. They conveyed it via Washington. They used U.S. diplomatic channels to pass the message. They were using the U.S. as a conduit, and in doing so, they were implicitly trying to confirm the internationalization of the issue. They were trying to get that U.S. signature on the deal.
And what was India's response? Sent back through those same U.S. channels.
India's response was firm, non-intermediary, and just brilliant in its simplicity and its execution. The demand was simple. Have them call us directly.
Wow.
That's it.
That, to me, is the perfect encapsulation of India's entire ironclad position on bilateralism.
It is. It's a message that says, we appreciate the U.S. handling the phones and helping connect the call, but you are not mediators. You are switchboard operators.
The message was unmistakable. No intermediaries, no third-party choreography, and absolutely no mediation theater that could later be spun into a diplomatic victory for Pakistan or a claim of credit by the U.S.
It stripped the entire process of the international validation Pakistan was so desperately seeking.
And the outcome confirms that this maneuvering worked. The ceasefire was agreed upon.
Bilaterally.
Right.
Directly between India and Pakistan. It was precisely what India had proposed days earlier when they declared the end of their own limited military action.
The sources are really specific about what was not involved in this final agreement, right? This is crucial for dismantling that U.S. narrative.
Extremely specific and detailed, they listed out. There was no Modi-Trump phone call on the matter to finalize the deal. There was no threat of punitive American measures like 200% tariffs being leveled to force India's hand.
Right. That story was out there.
And definitively, there was no American brokered deal. The U.S. helped create the space for the call to happen, but the final handshake was strictly between New Delhi and Islamabad.
So the final outcome was just Pakistan belatedly accepting the very same de-escalation that India had offered unilaterally 4 days earlier.
Yes, but only after they tried and failed to drag the U.S. into the center of the dispute. The sequence, when you look at it from India's perspective, has this air of strategic irony.
It's like they're saying, you could have just picked up the phone 4 days ago and accepted our limited terms.
Exactly. But instead, you tried to drag an international audience in, you forced a highly dangerous escalation, almost started a major war, and now you're back here, accepting those exact same terms.
By forcing that direct bilateral phone call, India ensured that the diplomatic credit for the pause remained exactly where their policy dictates it must, between the two involved nations.
They completely undermined the internationalization effort. They got the ceasefire they wanted, but on their own doctrinal terms.
The contrast in those two narratives is just staggering. One side is claiming a monumental diplomatic victory, and the other is insisting it was basically just a procedural reroute back to their initial offer.
It's a huge gap in perception.
So now let's really analyze the high cost of what might seem to an outsider like a harmless boast by a third-party leader. Why is symbolic credit so strategically toxic to India? What does this all really mean for their security?
It's because granting that symbolic credit, just letting the U.S. narrative of a brokered peace stand unchallenged, wouldn't just be about being polite or impolite. It would shatter India's core security doctrine. It would, in their view, guarantee future terrorist attacks.
Because it validates the playbook.
It validates the entire playbook. The sources detail three utterly unacceptable implications that crediting Trump or any third party would signal to the world and, more importantly, to Pakistan's military leadership.
Okay, let's break down those three implications in detail. What's the first one?
First, if the U.S. brokered a deal, it implies that Kashmir has been internationalized. Just like that, 50 years of diplomacy are gone. It nullifies the entire strategic basis of the Simla Agreement and creates a clear precedent for future third-party interference. It means India surrenders control over its own regional policy.
Okay, that's a huge loss. What's the second implication?
Second, and this is the most dangerous one, it implies that terrorism successfully forced mediation.
It worked.
It worked. It legitimizes the use of violence as a political tool.
Uh-huh.
The message sent to Islamabad's military headquarters would be crystal clear. Keep the violence dialed up high enough, and Washington will always step in and give you the international platform you crave. You are rewarding the very behavior you want to stop.
And the third consequence, which ties right back to the Pahalgam attack itself.
It implies that the Pahalgam attack achieved its strategic goal. You have to remember that goal was never to win a military battle. The goal was to draw in external powers, to validate Pakistan's claims and elevate the issue. By accepting U.S. credit, India would be retrospectively validating the strategic efficacy of that attack. It would be saying, congratulations, your terrorist attack was a success.
So in short, giving credit amounts to strategically rewarding terrorism and validating Pakistan's entire existential approach to the conflict.
It's not a small diplomatic favor. It's a profound strategic error. And that's why the sources stress over and over that India's refusal is not personal. It's not about Trump or Modi. It is purely doctrinal.
It's about preserving that decades-long principle that violence will not buy you diplomatic leverage.
If you allow that leverage to be bought even once, you have created a permanent incentive structure for future violence. You're forcing India into an endless cycle of having to manage these crises. So the refusal is an act of long-term strategic self-preservation.
But those outside observers might still wonder about the optics, right? Especially given the very public, very friendly political relationship that was cultivated between Prime Minister Modi and the former president.
They might ask, did Modi simply lack the political generosity to give a powerful ally a small, symbolic win?
Right. The sources tackle this suggestion head-on, don't they? They contrast this doctrinal refusal with Modi's personal history and his actual political actions.
They do, and this contrast is fascinating because it proves just how immutable the doctrine is. The source provides a very specific anecdote to dismantle this idea that Modi is inherently allergic to generosity or goodwill.
Tell us about the Gujarat salary anecdote.
Okay, so when Modi was transitioning from his long role as chief minister of Gujarat to become prime minister in Delhi, he had accumulated his entire salary for his tenure.
He hadn't spent it.
He hadn't, and he didn't keep it or use it for himself. Instead, he donated that entire accumulated sum of money to create a welfare and education fund. And it was designed specifically to benefit the children of his personal staff drivers, cleaners, aides.
That's not the action of a man who is inherently petty or incapable of generous acts.
Not at all. It demonstrates a deep personal commitment to the people around him. And then you have his political actions.
Politically, he went to extraordinary lengths to show goodwill to President Trump, providing generosity that was concrete, visible, and had a global impact, especially inside the American political landscape.
Absolutely. The sources list the unprecedented political goodwill Modi did extend to Trump, things that went far beyond typical diplomatic pleasantries.
Like the rallies.
The rallies. He gave President Trump the largest mass rally of his entire political career on U.S. soil, the Howdy Modi event in Houston, Texas.
That was a huge, visible, and frankly unprecedented political endorsement from a foreign leader to a sitting U.S. president, delivered on the president's home turf, and it mobilized a crucial demographic.
And he didn't stop there. He followed that up with an even larger rally in India, the Namaste Trumpism in Ahmedabad. I mean, few foreign leaders in history have extended such visible, public, and politically valuable validation to a U.S. president.
So he was willing to be a strategic political partner in the realm of domestic politics and optics.
Absolutely. So the sources draw this sharp, non-negotiable line. Modi was happy to extend massive political goodwill rallies, endorsements, personal generosity, but he was unwilling to surrender something far more valuable than optics.
That's the key takeaway. The one thing Modi was unwilling to give was strategic validation of a narrative that fundamentally undermines India's core security doctrine.
And that clarifies the hierarchy of priorities. Personal relationships and political favors are one thing. Compromising a national existential doctrine against the use of terrorism to gain diplomatic leverage is something else entirely. That asset, which guarantees India's long-term security, is absolutely non-negotiable.
So this brings us to a challenging question, and I want to push on it. Wasn't this refusal, despite the doctrine, just a form of diplomatic stubbornness? Trump's involvement was clearly the reason Pakistan felt the pressure to call, even if the call was rerouted. Isn't India, in a way, sacrificing a real-world necessary de-escalation for a purely semantic doctrinal win? Aren't they prioritizing theory over safety?
That's a great question, but it assumes that de-escalation was solely reliant on the U.S. India's whole contention, supported by the sources, is that the de-escalation was already built into their own limited response and their subsequent declaration of non-escalation 4 days prior.
They'd already offered the off-ramp.
They had built and offered the off-ramp. Pakistan chose to drive right past it and escalate, which is what forced the U.S. intervention. So by forcing the direct bilateral call, India believes it achieved the necessary de-escalation without sacrificing the doctrine. They got the strategic win, which was preserving bilateralism, and the tactical win, which was the ceasefire, because the danger ultimately was a self-inflicted wound by Pakistan. The cost of a temporary semantic win for Trump was simply too high if it meant granting Islamabad a perpetual diplomatic lever of terror.
Now let's pull back from this specific crisis to look at the broader geopolitical frustration that really colors all of India's thinking. The refusal to credit Trump isn't just about a single event. It's part of a deep-seated systemic frustration in New Delhi regarding how major global powers handle Pakistan.
It is. This frustration is tied to what India perceives as an almost historical reflex from global powers, a kind of muscle memory.
What's that reflex?
The source points out that both China and the United States periodically revert to a British Raj-style divide-and-rule instinct.
What does that mean in the 21st century?
It means they have this tendency that sees Pakistan not as a problematic ideological state that needs to be reformed, but merely as a useful strategic chess piece. This tendency leads them to appease or utilize Pakistan, often by funding its military or looking the other way on certain issues, specifically to needle India, or to create a regional balance that serves their own external interests rather than regional stability.
And India's argument is that this entire approach is fundamentally flawed because these major powers refuse to recognize the true, highly problematic nature of the Pakistani state, the nature we discussed right at the start.
Exactly. The source uses another blunt and provocative analogy to try and shake the international community out of this transactional view of Pakistan.
What's the analogy?
Pakistan is not a normal balancing lever, but rather Iran with nukes.
Or with nukes. That is meant to shock observers into realizing the sheer gravity of what they believe they're dealing with.
It is. It suggests two things simultaneously: profound ideological extremism and profound danger because of the nuclear arsenal.
So let's spend a moment analyzing the actual power structure in Pakistan according to these sources. This seems essential for understanding why external policy so often fails there.
The sources are absolutely unambiguous about the difference between the constitutional reality and the operational reality.
What's the bottom line?
The bottom line is that Pakistan is fundamentally not a democracy in the Western sense. It is not civilian-ruled. The political figure serving as prime minister is explicitly described in the material as ornamental, a functional stage prop for international and domestic consumption.
So if you're a U.S. diplomat landing in Islamabad, are you shaking the prime minister's hand for the cameras, knowing that you need to get the general on the phone right after to discuss anything of substance?
That is precisely the dynamic that New Delhi sees the international community consistently ignoring or downplaying. Real power resides completely and consistently with the military high command.
They control everything that matters.
They control foreign policy, defense, the national budget, and crucially, the nuclear arsenal and the ISI's proxy terrorism operations.
So the conclusion then is that the army chief holds all of the real power.
Yes. The sources conclude that Azam Munir, or whoever holds that office at any given time, is, in effect, Pakistan's Ayatollah. The Pakistan army is the regime, and all the civilian institutions, the parliament, the judiciary, the prime minister's office, are essentially political stage props designed to convey a facade of normalcy to the outside world.
Which means engaging with the civilian government is often just diplomatic theater.
It's an exercise in theater, not reality. And that, the sources argue, is why decades of U.S. aid and diplomacy have often failed to change the core policies, because they're often talking to the wrong people, or at least not the people with the final say.
Okay, so given this assessment of Pakistan as an ideological, military-run state with nuclear weapons, India asks a very simple, very frustrated question to the international community.
A very frustrated question, yes.
Why is Pakistan perpetually indulged? Why is the rest of the world so willing to keep treating it like a normal transactional partner?
This is where the contrast with how other nations are treated becomes incredibly sharp and really underlines India's deep frustration with what it sees as global hypocrisy. The sources cite how other powerful countries react to existential threats that are far less severe than the ideological project that India believes it's facing.
For instance.
For instance, they recall that just one major terrorist attack in Beijing, an attack linked to Uyghur separatists, led China to completely remake the entire province of Xinjiang with iron force. This resulted in mass detentions and a security crackdown that shocked the world. But it was decisive.
And if you look at the other half of that analogy, Iran, the U.S. has been willing to impose crippling economic sanctions, political isolation, intense diplomatic pressure.
Exactly, and why? Because it recognizes Iran's ideological threat. The source notes what the United States has done or is willing to do to Iran, a state it classifies as a sponsor of terrorism and a profound threat to regional stability.
So the double standard, from India's perspective, is baffling and dangerous.
Completely. If a non-nuclear state like Iran is treated so harshly for its ideological extremism and its use of proxies, why is a nuclear-armed state that actively uses terrorism as its primary policy tool, a state described as Iran with nukes, so often treated as a normal state that just requires balancing or appeasement against India?
This perpetual indulgence, then, it connects directly back to the doctrinal struggle we started this whole deep dive with.
It's the whole ballgame. The persistent belief in Islamabad that Pakistan can use terrorism to gain leverage continues because the world, in its pursuit of short-term balancing, or transactional alliances, or just immediate de-escalation, treats Pakistan like a normal state.
Instead of recognizing it as the ideological project led by a military regime that India believes it truly is.
And this international softening of the issue only reinforces Pakistan's core policy of using violence to achieve internationalization. It guarantees the cycle of violence will continue. So India views its doctrinal refusal to grant credit as the only consistent, reliable pushback against this global indulgence. It's their way of holding the line.
This deep dive has really shown that what appeared on the surface as, I don't know, diplomatic pettiness or maybe an ego conflict between two leaders is, in fact, an iron-willed adherence to a security doctrine.
A doctrine formulated over 50 years to survive what it sees as a permanent existential threat.
India's denial is not of the United States' helpful role in de-escalating during a very dangerous moment.
No, they acknowledge that.
But it's a denial of the entire framing of the event as some grand peace negotiation brokered by a third party.
And we've established the three key defining differences that New Delhi put forward to protect its strategic space and its doctrine against that U.S. narrative of a brokered peace.
Let's review them. First, there was no peace, only a pause.
Right. For India, it was a tactical intermission, not a fundamental shift in the existential nature of the relationship. The clock was simply reset.
Second, there was no mediation, only a rerouted phone call.
India held that absolute line. The resolution had to be bilateral, which stripped away the validation of internationalization that Pakistan had sought to achieve through its use of violence.
And third, there was no deal, only a belated acceptance of what India had already offered unilaterally days earlier.
The final agreement was secured precisely on India's bilateral terms, after Pakistan's attempt to internationalize it failed.
The final synthesis for you, the listener, seems to be pretty clear. For New Delhi to grant that symbolic credit for peace to any external actor would be to concede ground on three non-negotiable fronts.
The bilateral status of Kashmir, the efficacy of terrorism as a diplomatic tool, and ultimately India's own national sovereignty.
And that price is just strategically far too high to pay, regardless of the political goodwill or personal relationships extended between leaders.
The doctrine is supreme.
The sources highlight this historical pattern, this instinct of external powers, whether it's the U.S. or China, to revert to that divide and rule strategy for the subcontinent.
Treating Pakistan as a normal transactional state, despite what India argues is its reality as an ideological military regime.
So, if the true power structure in Pakistan is the military, which the sources analogize to this Ayatollah figure, that raises a really profound and challenging strategic question for the entire international community.
It's the question that hangs over everything.
What does it truly take for an external power to shift its strategy from simply managing the conflict, putting out fires, managing the episodic violence and the temporary ceasefires, to actually resolving the underlying ideological project that fuels it?
And maybe more importantly, even if they tried to make that profound shift, is it even possible to dismantle that core ideological tension without granting Pakistan the very strategic validation that India fears most, which is, of course, the internationalization of Kashmir?
That feels like the fundamental paradox here.
It's the structural conflict that continues to shape the geopolitics of the entire region, and it ensures that this pause is eventually and inevitably only temporary.